We learned before that when the Torah says that somebody has to pay for the damage that his animal did, it's not done in the way that many people would have thought. You don't pay for the grain that the animal ate, but rather you pay for how much the land is worth less that now the grain is not on it. How much a field is devalued, how much it was worth before and how much it's worth now. How much a field got worth less from the fact that this person, this animal rather, ate the grain. And the Mishnah says, Ketzad mishalem es mashi zika. How does someone pay, or how much does someone pay for the damage of mashi zika? Shamin beisa ba'isa sadeh. We evaluate a beisa, which is a 50 by 50 amos piece of property in that field. Kama hoisa yafe v'kama hi yafe. How much a 50 by 50 amma piece of land with grain is worth, and how much this piece of land now is worth now that the grain was eaten up. I mean, what the difference in price between these two pieces of land? Now, it seems to be pretty simple then. You just take a base saw, which is 50 by 50 amas, with all the grain, and we see how much it's worth less. The only problem is that how much does a base saw itself cost? And that means, as we will explain, that a base saw can have many, many different prices. For example, if let's say in our case over here, these two guys are throwing a ball and one of them goes and knocks down a bottle of soda. So obviously, and destroys the soda, and he has to pay for it. How much does that soda cost? Well, it depends. If you buy it from a soda machine, it's $2. But you could buy it also in a case of 24, which is going to be then 83 cents a bottle. Or you could buy a pallet, which will come out to be 24 cents a bottle. Or you could buy a whole truckload, which will come out to be 4 cents a bottle. So you see over here that although somebody damaged a bottle, there are many different prices for that bottle, and it's relative to where you get it from. Is it part of a bigger package? The larger the package, the cheaper each bottle will become. So in our case, where the Mishnah says that you evaluate a base saw, which is a piece of land that's 50 amas by 50 amas, we need to establish how much that base saw itself cost. And Rashi explains that a base saw is a relatively small piece of land, and it rarely gets sold by itself. And only poor people could afford it. Only poor people who don't have a lot of money, that's the only piece of land that they're able to afford, and they pay a premium for that piece of land. The demand is low, and they pay a premium. So, for example, they'll pay $250. This would be the same thing as somebody who is poor cannot afford to buy a truckload of soda. He doesn't have $1,000. He does have $2. So he will end up being able to buy one bottle of soda for a lot of money, but that's all he has. He does not have enough money to buy a truckload of soda. So base saw is the same thing. A base saw is a small piece of land. Only poor people are able to buy it. It's rare for it to hit the market, and there's a lot of demand and very little supply of it. And therefore, when it hits the market, people pay a relatively high price. Now, there's another reason why a damage on... So now, if you were to assess how much a base saw gets sold for and how much it's worth now, the damager will end up paying a lot of money. Another reason why the damager will have to pay a lot of money if you assess a base saw by itself, just how much a base saw would sell for, is since it's such a small piece of land, even a little bit of it missing makes a big difference. If you buy a can of soda from a soda machine and it's half empty, then you'd want your money back. If you buy a truckload of soda and one of the cans is half empty, it doesn't make that much of a difference. So in this case, it would make a big difference. So for example, if you would take a base saw by itself and compare it with another base saw, with a full base saw to a partial base saw, so a full base saw costs $250. A partial base saw will end up being, let's say, 15% less. The damager will have to end up paying $37.50 in our case over here for the damage caused, because it's expensive and the amount of damage is very noticeable and will then be will make a much bigger difference. On the other hand, let's say somebody bought a very large farm with many base saw. In this case, it's 162 base saw. So he pays $116,200 for the farm. It comes out that he ended up paying $100 for every base saw. Now, if you would compare a base saw from this farm, so the base saw, a full base saw costs $100. With a little damage, it costs $90. So he'll end up only getting a $10 bill. That's the amount of, that is the difference on what on the damage that happened over here. So again, the price of a Beisah, it really depends on how much he ended up paying for this piece of land before we could determine how much damage was done to the land. So it depends really how big the Beisah is. And our Gemara over here seeks to determine how big is the Beisah that our Mishnah talks about. Our Mishnah talks about that you assess a Beisah, how much it's worth before damage was done and how much it's worth after the damage is done. And the Gemara tries to figure out what type of Beisah we're talking about. Can't be a Beisah by itself, that would be way too expensive. Can't be a Beisah part of a massive farm, it would be way too little. So how exactly, what Beisah exactly does the Mishnah have in mind? And it brings down three opinions. The first opinion is the opinion of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, who says 1 saw out of 60 saw. That means we look at a 60 saw farm. How much does a 60 saw farm cost? In our case over here, let's say $9,000. And how much that means that every saw cost $150. And then we assess that. $150 for a saw out of a 60 saw farm. And by damaging it, it costs 10% reduction in value. It'd be $15. So that's how much the owner would have to pay. It's $15. You assess it relative to a 60 saw farm. That means you take a 60 saw farm, pull out 1 saw out of that. How much would someone pay if he was buying 60 saws? How much would each saw cost? And then make the calculation off of that price. Now, the Gemara brings other opinions, and that's the opinion of Rav Yanai. Rav Yanai says that you can't use a 60 saw farm. And the reason for that is that the nizik will lose out. The one that got damaged will lose out. Because a 60 saw field is sold for relatively cheap. Since there are less buyers interested in that size land. It's too expensive for regular people. In our case before, it was $9,000 for the piece of land. And that's too expensive for regular people, but it's too small for wealthy people. That means it's really in a no man's land over here. It's for regular people, they're not able to spend that much money on land. But for someone who's wealthy, they wouldn't buy such a small piece of land. It's only for people who want to be wealthy, who want to give off the appearances of being wealthy, that buy this size land. And it's a very, very unusual. It's an unusual size land, and therefore a piece of land of this size has less people that are interested in buying it, and therefore the demand is less, and the price on each Beisah will come out to be cheap. And the nizik will end up losing out. He'll only get $15 in our case. So rather, what Rav Yanai says is you pay 1 tarkov out of 60 tarkovim. So again, this is our 60 saw land. A tarkov is a half a saw. So he says half these saws are gone. And it's 60 tarkovim is 30 saw and half, which would be an end of 30 saw, 30 half saw, which is 60 tarkovim. And that costs $6,000. Now that's affordable for a regular person. Can't afford $9,000, but he can afford $6,000. 1 tarkov, which is a half a saw, is worth $100. And that's what you do. You make that assessment. How much does 1 tarkov cost with grain? $100. 1 tarkov without grain, the amount of damage done is $90 because it's missing that grain. It'll be $10, which will then, out of a full saw, he'll end up paying $20 for a full saw worth of damage. The Gemara goes on and brings a third opinion, and that is the opinion of Chizkiah. And Chizkiah says that he pays 60 times the amount of damage that occurred over here. And what that means is, if let's say his animal ate grain, and that grain is on a piece of land, that amount of grain, we go and you multiply that piece of land by 60. And that is the amount that we assess after we see how much 60 times that land is. We assess how much it's worth with a full one and how much one with damage is worth, and that is the difference that he pays.